Welcome to this very special seminar roundtable hui that we have arranged on a very important topic. My name is Marta Avanos. I'm the director of the Europe Institute here in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Auckland. Our mission is to talk about things that matter to our critical understanding from a perspective here in Auckland relating to issues in Europe. But with all the changes, the extraordinary times we are living in globally and locally, we thought it would be a great opportunity to discuss some really important issues, some extraordinarily important issues that relate to all of us here in Aotearoa and across Europe and Britain, America and elsewhere. So it is my great honour and pleasure to introduce to you to three remarkable colleagues of mine, Professor Elizabeth Rata from the School of Education, is it called? No? Yes, and Professor John Morgan, also from the School of Education, and Dr. Claire Meehan, who is a lecturer in criminology here at the university. They're going to talk 10 minutes each about their kind of reflections on the changes and the importance of those changes for education policies around the world and the challenges they face, we face in those fields, in the field of education particularly. They're going to talk about 10 minutes each, then they're going to get a chance to respond to each other, to kind of reflect on what the others have said. And then we're going to open up the floor for some questions and have your involvement as well. Now you will notice that this is being taped. The good news is you will not be taped, but the discussions that evolve on around this table will be taped and will be available for you to refer back to later online, and we will be sharing that link. If you're interested in receiving that link, but also in signing up to any news of future seminars that we're hosting, feel free to put your name and address, email address on this piece of paper. So I'll circulate that. So our first speaker will be Professor Rata, who is a specialist. Let me just make sure I get this right. Who's a specialist in political economy of knowledge. She has written two very important books, A Political Economy of Neoliberal Capitalism and one on the politics of knowledge in education. She is also the co-director of the Knowledge in Education Research Unit, which is situated here in Auckland. Professor John Morgan is the other co-director of the unit and is the author of many things, including the book Culture and Political Economy of Schooling, which came out last year. And next to me, Dr. Claire Meehan is a specialist on youth, digital technologies, sex and drugs, and their uses and abuses in youth culture as well. So we're going to have 10 minutes each, then another response, and then we're opening up the floor to your questions, responses, and ideas. So, over to you, Professor.
Thanks, Nadia. Well, I've entitled mine Populism, Rituals and Symbols. I went through a number of titles, but I finally settled on that. And I want to talk about populism in terms of the big picture. And I think if we understand populism as a tendency in modernity, rather than see it as something that's just become a force in the last few decades, see, it's an ongoing force in modernity. And it's that difficult balancing between the pull of traditionalism, and I'm going to gloss traditionalism as culture in what I say, and the pull of modernity. And those two forces sort of wax and wane in their various effects in democratic pluralist societies like our one. It's unsurprising when you think about what traditionalism does offer. I mean, it provides social stability, it provides psychological security to many people, and that counters the unpredictability and the future-facingness of modernity, and the fact that modernity is held together by ideals and by ideas rather than by concrete things of what we actually do. It's very difficult to be modern. But traditionalism, culture, the shared languages, the beliefs, the myths, the history, the symbols, the rituals, that all gives us that feeling of belonging. And not just that, the feeling of belonging, they actually give us the group itself to which we can belong. So no wonder it's such a powerful force. So it gives us that connection to the group, but it also gives us the group. Now, on the other hand, modern pluralist democratic societies are made up of people who don't share that common background, that common history, but does give us human rights, democracy, equality, the very ideas that have been used to throw off culture, to attack culture, to move on from culture. I don't know if any of you saw this in today's newsroom, but there was an interesting article by a Tongan academic based here, Dr. Tomoe Folau, who, it's entitled "Why Tonga Has No Word for Human Rights." I thought, do have a look at it, because it's very much what I'm saying. You know, there's this opposition. So what to do about the opposition, and that's what I want to talk about for the short time I've got. How do we live with the universalism, traditionalism or culturalism tension, because it's not going to go away? It reappeared with considerable force from the 1970s, where it was a real shift towards culturalism. Whether it's monoculturalism, biculturalism, multiculturalism, that idea of culturalism as the structuring principle of a society is really what I mean. It's ironic that today's populism is actually the inheritor of the multicultural decades, because it's also seeing culture as that structuring force, but in this case it's the monoculture of the one dominant group. But it's still the same idea that somehow culture is what ties us, is what structures the society. It's what makes us and not you, that sort of idea. And it's an uncrossable gap between us and them, because it's located in the past and it's immutable. It's not ongoing. It's not created in an ongoing way. So what can we do about this? The fact that we live in this tension, and we will continue to live in this tension. And what role does a national education system play in it? So I wonder if we could think about our democratic society as not just being a collection of diverse groups. It certainly is, but it's also something more than that. It's a new entity, but it's a way of understanding ourselves that's incredibly vulnerable. It's vulnerable because it has such a short history to draw on. It's mainly vulnerable because it exists in the form of ideals about what it wants to be. Ideals of human rights, of gender equality, and so on. And it takes a concrete form in institutions and the operations of institutions. So it doesn't have that deep, visceral heart connection at the individual psychological level that culture gives us. This new entity, this new society, still requires a way to hold itself together, a sense of how do we understand who we are. Durkheim called it a collective consciousness. Bourdieu referred to it as a consensus. Habermas talks about communicative rationality. It's that idea of how, given that we don't find our unity from the past, how do we create it now? It exists in the public space, hence the absolute importance of secularism as the mechanism for the public space where all we different groups can come together with this sense of a new entity, a new collective consciousness. Populism is when the largest group takes over that public space and makes the loudest noise and insists that its culture, its history, is what has created this new entity, this new social identity, forgetting, of course, that everywhere modernity has arisen, it has crushed, it has overturned culture and the oppression of culture, because all groups have cultures which are oppressive. I mean, women have been oppressed in all cultures. So it's ideals, this sort of modernity, this new entity, the social identity is ideals, it's institutions, it's not culture. But it's very difficult to live like this. The price we pay for such openness, this forward-looking way we look at ourselves, is that we don't have the security of rituals and symbols, which somehow we seem to need. The closed group has these, of course. By its very nature, modernity must be opposed to fixed anything, to fixed rituals, to fixed symbols. But we still have, within the social entity, all the various diverse groups who within their groups do maintain the rituals and the symbols and the customs and cultures of the past. But as I said, that public space where we all meet with this new sense of ourselves, this new very vulnerable sense of ourselves, is the secular public space. The problem is that as human beings we do seem to need rituals and symbols. Where do we get them from in this state of modernity? I think that we need to know the danger of reviving rituals and symbols from the past. Can we still use some? Can they be modified to share the democratic purpose? Or are they simply creating a new traditionalist group, building its own particular culture, which will end up being fixed and exclusive? Just thinking about this, it's occurred to me how knowing our history is really, really important. Knowing the history can help us cope, I think, with the change and insecurities of living in an open society. It can also help us make wiser decisions about what rituals and what symbols we do choose to adopt. Sometimes, as with Christchurch, the sheer immensity of what happened meant that there was a deep psychological need for something, and it took various forms. Is that a good thing, or isn't it a good thing? There's discussion now about the extent to which something from one group, which is oppressive of women, seen as a symbol of female oppression, should be used in the representation of the society. It's a very difficult balancing act to make when something like Christchurch happens. So really, what we're required to do is to create rituals and symbols for a democratic society, knowing that these can never provide the absolute security and inclusiveness that rituals and symbols are meant to provide. They can't do really fully what we want them to do, but we need them. And yet, as I say, that it's a problem. Now, I know I need to stop in a minute, so I'll stop on this note. Because we need these things, where can we get them? That even if they are vulnerable, even if they are uneasy, if they are open to, if they don't have the fixed, solid nature of the rituals and symbols of the fixed society, I think our education system should be a system that is absolutely crammed full with history. Every child in the country needs a full and comprehensive understanding of history, because there's something about knowing about your history and your history that can help people cope with the fact that it's gone. And knowing history may prevent us falling into the dangers of presentism, where we say that the past should be what we think it should be, rather than what it actually was. The other thing we need in our curriculum is the creative arts. Lots and lots of art and drama and literature, because they provide the raw material for new, constantly recreating rituals and symbols, which will not be fixed as we'd perhaps like them to be, but in their not being fixed nature, that provides a way for none of our groups to become fixed, inward-looking, and traditional and populist. So that's my little bit. How long did I take? A while. Thank you. Yeah.
So just to sort of contextualise what I'm going to talk about, obviously I'm very self-conscious of my accent. We were talking about this earlier. I am not from Auckland. I've been in Auckland for 5 years. I grew up in Belfast in Northern Ireland. I lived in London for a number of years prior to coming here. And last semester I was on sabbatical, which I spent at the London School of Economics. So during that time I've been back and forward, pre-Brexit and during Brexit. So yes, I've a lot to talk about with regards to that. My research is concerned with young people and their digital sexual lives. I'm particularly interested in their views and understandings of the role of pornography in their lives, with regard to the bigger, broader issues, so consent, gender, misogyny, those kind of things, age. And I have been leading a number of projects here in Auckland, but two of the biggest that I'm sort of coming off the end of now. So one was looking at young people, it was working with young people here in Auckland. The other, and it was around the both consensual and non-consensual sharing of intimate images, as well as understanding pornography. The second is the nudie project. So having been in the process of wrapping up working with young people, I thought, well, okay, it would be quite interesting to look at older people, so 16 plus, in and around New Zealand to get their perceptions on the sharing of intimate images as well. So intimate images commonly referred to as sexting, dick pics, revenge porn, a number of different terms, all of which are quite problematic. So essentially my work is co-constructed with young people. It is sex positive or sex critical, and it is harm reduction focused. So I don't come from an abstinence focus, rather I'm pragmatic. I try and understand the issues. I have a large interest in sex and sexuality education and how it encompasses these things. So of the outcomes that have come from this research, the main theme for me is the issue of consent. So it's the perceptions and indeed misconceptions of consent. Consent, sexual consent is not a new thing. The debate has merely evolved. It's evolved with digital technology, but the issues largely remain the same. Young people tend to stay away from the term consent. They see it as a sort of abstract and almost a permission-seeking process. So you seek permission, you grant or deny permission, whereas consent really should be a process, and it should be a pleasurable process that encourages engagement the whole way. For the majority of young people, that's not actually how they view it or how they practice it. We know that with consent, I've got the shakes now, I'm all nervous. We know that, sorry to professors that I'm a baby academic. We know that
going well.
we know that with consent, so obviously choice and agency should inform consent, and that's what we want, that's what we strive for. However, we know realistically consent does not happen in a vacuum. So we need to have conversations around empowerment, about coercion, around pressure, around objectification. But those things can't really be discussed unless we bring to the fore the issue of consent itself. The role of agency is quite often stripped whenever we talk about consent. The victim-blaming rhetoric, both with young people and with older people, is very much there. And empowerment and thinking about consent as an empowering tool is seriously lacking. You know, consent isn't just about sexual activity. It goes so far beyond that, but that's not how it's viewed. So I'm thinking about the changing of the tide and how this, to my mind, has changed in recent years. For starters, I think there's been a new feminist backlash. I remember having a chat with a teacher at one of the schools, one of my sample schools, and we had this really progressive conversation. It was about how, you know, we go about not victim blaming young girls if their consent is breached with intimate images. And she walked me out to the car as we had this conversation, and just before we parted, she said, you know, my husband always laughs at me and he teases me for being a feminist, but like, you know, I'm not. And I sort of thought, oh, okay, fair enough. But that seems to have been replicated time and time again, that it's this notion of being a feminist is back to the dark ages. Why are you a feminist? Why are you not a humanist? Surely being a feminist is discriminatory by its very intent. And that is both coming from young women and young men. And it very much strengthens this neoliberal framework that we all, no matter who we are, need to take personal responsibility for our actions. So we walk a very fine line between, we don't want to be seen as frigid, we wish to be desired, yet we have to realise that if we do make a choice to send an image for one person and one person only, if that person breaches our consent, well, you know, that was our decision to do it. So this victim-blaming rhetoric that I talked about is, the more research I do, the stronger that becomes. We seem to be resorting back to the negative isms. You know, we've got racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, all of these things, some things that 3 years ago, it wouldn't have been okay to say, but they're almost coming back into vogue again. It's becoming fashionable to say these things. You don't want to be seen as a snowflake, so you have to push that forward. And even with regards to talking about the issues around consent itself, you know, some people said, well, you don't want to be seen as the fun place. Whenever we talked about the link with the Me Too movement, there was a lot of sort of sympathy for the offender, and it was, well, you know, obviously the person couldn't take a job because otherwise, and I was quite shocked with all of that, and that was replicated very much with the older people, more so with the older people than with the young people. So I guess sort of pulling us back to education and what we do with it, we know, and we've known for a long time, that the majority of young people have a very restricted heteronormative experience at school. We tend not to focus on consent, or if we do, we're telling young people, again, the jug and mug, that this is what consent is, you should be able to say no, without actually addressing the nuances of what consent actually means. We're muddying the waters further by introducing these negative isms that I spoke about. We remove agency, we balance the pressure to consent with the backlash and blame for consenting. And considering that, you know, all of this is in the public discourse, this is obviously influencing how sex and sexuality education, A, is taught, and B, schools are willing to teach it. Particularly, schools don't want to get a reputation for being seen as that sort of school, and that was very much at the forefront of a number of the teachers that I spoke about. But it is really important that we do challenge these things, more so than just thinking about it in terms of purely about sex, as in sexual activity or sex education. We need to be thinking about it more in terms of ethics, agency, empowerment, and really sexual citizenship, because that's not what we're doing at the moment. That's it.
So, when we posited the idea of this session, I was much less confused than I am now. I had a dream. I say, oh, Martin Luther King, but I did have a dream the other night. And I was at University Senate, and it was full of zombies, and they were debating Brexit. It was like a really weird moment, because I've been sort of doing a lot of my work and also following the Brexit events, and there's these zombie universities were being talked about, and then I sort of had this terrible. I woke up in a real shock. I'm in Senate and we're discussing Brexit with zombies. So that gives a sense of my confused state of mind as I began to prepare this, really. So the arguments which I'm going to make get a little progressively more shaky as I go on. And they're shaky from the beginning. But I suppose the point I want to make from the beginning is that what I want to say is, and argue here, is that if we, as events, Brexit, the election of President Donald Trump, and perhaps more tenuously Christchurch, for me represent something bigger, which is, I think, the severing of the link between education, and I'm going to talk about universities rather than just education as a whole, and the wider society and culture. I think we have a crisis going on about the disconnect between our universities and our education and the wider society. And I'm not quite sure how that's going to get resolved and how it should be resolved, but I want to sort of get to that point where the problem is made. So I suppose the first thing to say is this notion that David Baker, a sociologist at Stanford, made fairly recently, a couple of years ago, to say that we've often think that schooling in universities or education follows trends in society, so that because we live in a neoliberal economy, we have neoliberal schooling. And he makes the argument that it's not the case the other way. In fact, education is more determining than determinate. And that, in fact, the values of the educated society are increasingly shaping the values of us all. So a good example would be, for instance, if you go for a job in the church, you will expect to be interviewed by somebody who will be impartial, you expect to have a CV, you'd expect some sort of product of what we call education, rational, civilised values, enlightenment values, would apply to even the most medieval of institutions. And so this is an example of how education culture shapes everything. And we're completely outraged, of course, when girls or ethnic groups are excluded from formal schooling. And this is an indication from Baker's point of view, of how society has become schooled, a schooled society, as he calls it. And universities are part of that. The fact we're standing in this place here is a reflection of what we call the educational project, which I think is part of Elizabeth's modern project, which has two particular elements in English-speaking world. One is that it's about social democracy, about the equality of access to all, about providing a detached scholarly culture where the best that has been thought and said can be distributed and available to everyone. And the second is a much more technocratic one, which is about preparing people for the world of work. And it's a very simple thing, and when you ask most people, for most of the second half of the 20th century, what they want from schooling, they want people to be able to read, they want their children to be able to read the newspaper and take part in intelligent discussions, plus be able to get a job and find some valuable work. And it's very straightforward, and that's the modern project of schooling, into which when I started teaching in 1988, that's what I sort of believed was we were heading towards. But of course, the last 50 years have given us some shocks to that schooled society or that schooling culture. I'll just reel them off really in the order that they occurred. One perhaps would be the 1973 oil shock, which plunged the world into the Western world into recession, and from which economic growth has never quite restored itself at the same rate. The neoliberal Thatcherite Reaganite revolutions, which began to challenge the idea of the public sphere, would be another shock to the modern project of education, as would the increased globalisation and mobility of migration across the world, which changes the notion that we're educated in national systems rather than across boundaries. We move on to the idea of 9/11 in 2001, and in London 5/7, those terrorist attacks, which have changed the political mood. The financial crisis of 2007, 2008, the Eurozone crisis of 2010 and beyond, austerity, and eventually we get to the notion of Brexit in 2016, followed by Trump in 2016, later in 2016, and then Christchurch in 2019 in New Zealand, a place which is sort of bottom of the map and off the scale in that sense. All of these have challenged the notion of the modern idea of education. And I think educationists have to deal, and those of us working in universities have to deal with that reality. How do we respond? How should we respond? And so on. And what it brings us to realise, I think, the realisation is that the benefits of the school society have not been made available to all. And so part of the discourse or the way of thinking about these events, such as the election of Donald Trump and Brexit, is that somehow there was a divide between the educated and the non-educated, those who'd had the benefit of education. So the biggest correlation, the highest predictor of a Leave vote in Brexit was education. So the higher you went up the ladder, degree, A-levels, degree, master's degree, doctoral degree, the less likely you were to vote for Leave. And there were lots and lots of really quite nasty cartoons talking about the stupid people who voted Leave, and you can see that discourse all over the sort of the Brexit debates around Remain and Leave and so on. And the same was true of Donald Trump, of course, and it was those sort of rednecks down in Louisiana who did this, who were uneducated and somehow didn't quite sort of match the notion of the modern educated people. And the very interesting thing, I think, from all of this is that academics did not get it, in a sense. It became a sort of, so 87% of British academics polled the day before June the 23rd predicted that the result would be Remain. 6% said it would be Leave, 7% were unclear. So a really interesting question, how did academics get it so wrong? And it sort of raised huge issues for universities. There was an outpouring. There were academic conferences in London the day after, on the 24th, where academics abandoned their paper and started crying and turned it into a hooey about what's gone wrong in our university systems. University vice-chancellors were sort of called upon to defend what was going on in there, sort of to say the value of a university education. And a Tory minister wrote to all vice-chancellors of British universities and said, could you identify those staff who you think might lecture about Brexit so we can monitor what they are going to talk about? This divide, the mistrust of experts in academia, which is also true of the discourse around Donald Trump and the way in which the liberal elite in their New York, in Manhattan bubbles are seen as the sort of not out of touch with reality and so on. So in the same types of sort of, I suppose, Bourdieu called it the Homo academicus, is there in their tower, reading the books, but being completely divorced from everyday reality. And there's been quite a trade of people sort of on academic websites saying, well, if you'd worked in Grimsby or in Hull, you'd have got a sense that Leave was going to be an option, because there was a rather different sense of what was going on from the sort of the elites and so on. But for me, it does raise this question of this difference between this divide, so-called divide between academic values and the wider society, and what universities should do to respond to that. So this afternoon I was in an academic leadership course, and we had 3 senior university leaders who all talked to us, and I raised this question about what education, what society, trying to talk about what I was going to talk about really. And none of them sort of, they said, doesn't that just make a case for having more people educated? More people coming to learn? And part of me thinks, well, maybe that is the answer, or maybe not. So, if there is this divide, the response is how to bridge it, in a way. So I suppose there are some really good examples of academics trying to bridge this divide. So Arlie Russell Hochschild in the United States wrote a really interesting book called Strangers in Their Own Land, where she sort of starts by saying, look, I'm going to go, here I am eating my sort of Manhattan, New York sort of pretzel, and I'm just going to go down and see how the folks down there live. And because she's a sort of an ethnographer and an anthropologist, she goes and tries to talk to people, and it's a very interesting, readable book, which tries to get inside the world views and so on. There's a British academic called Lisa Mackenzie, who does sort of work with what she calls disadvantaged communities. She doesn't really call them that, but she says that's how they're labelled by policymakers and academics. So go and talk to those people. And then most interesting in the case of our sort of events that happened in Christchurch, there's an American sociologist called Michael Kimmel, who wrote a book called Angry White Men, and he went round and tried to interview members of the alt-right. He said, I'm a short, stocky Jewish man from New York, and I would go to the gun festivals and ask the question, will you talk to me about why you hate people like me? And very brave thing to do, but he produces this really interesting account of the mindsets of different groups. He's trying to bridge that divide. The question I've got really is how far and how often we bridge that divide, though. How we should or shouldn't. How should we respond? And this is where it gets shaky and controversial, and for me. it's my sense, and I haven't done any real scientific research on this, is that in the aftermath of the events in Christchurch, the shootings in Christchurch on the 15th of March, academic response has tended to mirror the broader responses of the society. Now, I think that's quite a good thing. If there's been an outpouring of liberal tolerance and sort of acceptance of diversity and so on, it's really good that academics are writing things that are supportive of that they respond in that particular way. But is that simply mirroring the values of a society? Is it kowtowing to some sort of political agenda? Shouldn't the response of academics be to delay their public voice, to spend time in the library or in communities and come back in 5 years' time when there's a different answer, when there's more complicated, more complex stories? And it's maybe this is why I'm saying I'm confused, because out of this divide that I think is real, the response of educators, university academics, has to be thought through and debated in intelligent ways. But then, and I sort of was really taken by listening to Claire's talk just a second ago, is there's also this notion that on the ground we have to respond to things. We have to challenge racism and homophobia and all those sort of isms that sort of shape our society. So academics are in a double bind. We're part of society, but we are a different part of it. We have to be, do we mirror it? Do we try to shift it, change it? These are extraordinary times for education. And what Elizabeth has talked about in terms of around populism requires us to rethink some of the older models. In our own discipline of education, if I was to bring it back to that, I don't think we have even begun to scratch the surface of some of these debates, because they do mean that we have to confront the dark side of modernity in many ways. Is that much of our notion of liberal optimism, and that if we teach the truth, people will come around and be enlightened, is increasingly hard to countenance in a world that tells us otherwise. So, yeah.
Thanks so much, John, and all of you. Elizabeth, did you want to take a moment to reflect on what the others have said?
That dark side of modernity. Here's an example of something which I heard about a couple of weeks ago and has really disturbed me. A group of Ministry of Education officials were invited to attend their usual monthly hui. And in the invitation was a request that the women not wear trousers, that they wear skirts. It really, really disturbed me. The justification was a bicultural justification. What disturbs me the most is how difficult it would be to criticise it.
But it would be very easy to criticise it.
You try criticising it.
It would be easy to criticise, is that what you said? Yes.
What?
So when you say bicultural, sorry, I know I'm talking out of turn, sorry.
No.
What do you mean by bicultural justification? What was the justification?
That because I think it was going to be held at a marae, or it was an event discussing Māori education, it was considered, or whoever sent the notice decided that it would be according to, that they would take a kaupapa approach, and this person had decided that the kaupapa was skirts. So, you know, it's interesting how dress still plays, this is still the signal of lots and lots of things, that dark side. What worries me is how difficult it is to criticise it. And, you know, thinking of what you said, John, about the role of academics, a lot of my writing up until recently has been about ethnic politics, and I've earned the unenviable reputation of being called a racist. So I shifted to writing about knowledge.
Yeah, that's easy.
Much easier, much easier. But the same problems are there. I'm still left with this problem of what we use culture for. Is it this psychological security? Is it the social stability? Or is it a political justification? Is it simply ethnic politics serving the particular group? So, yeah, no, your point is well made. I know what you're saying.
Yeah. Hearing a bit more context, I see, okay, it would be difficult to criticize, but maybe not impossible, I would like to think.
Well, I keep going.
Yeah, do you want to respond?
Yes, please. And just listening to that is making me think of some of the stuff that's come out of the schools as well. Where I remember whenever I was at school, I went to a convent school in Ireland and turned out a porn researcher, so there you go. But one of the things
No stereotypes there then.
one of the things that they used to make us do is you used to kneel and your skirt used to have to touch the floor. Now, the idea of this was because we didn't want to distract the boys or the male teachers, because if those skirts were too short, well, no work would get done. And that's still very much the case. You know, most schools still require their young women to wear skirts, and the skirts can't be too tight or too short. And again, it's because we don't want to distract anyone. So we're almost saying that objectification is okay, but dress isn't. And I find that very concerning. But then within the populism that you spoke about earlier, the populist feeling at the moment, which of course influences our discourse, which influences our schooling or sex and sexuality education. So this is obviously, you know, it is a course going into schools, and what John was saying about experts, mistrust of experts, and while you were talking about academic experts, I've noticed even in schools there's different levels of that mistrust. So for example, some of the schools mistrust some of the findings coming out of research, some of the staff at schools, whereas some of the students mistrust the experts brought in, or the expertise of teachers to teach about sex and sexuality education. And quite often this does go back to the sort of feminist question as well. I know there have been a number of anti-pornography educators coming into schools. They will not give a balanced view. They'll go very much into the negatives of pornography, but it's all very much wrapped up within a feminist thought. So for a lot of young people, they think that all feminism is anti-porn. And I'm not saying that, you know, feminism is either pro or anti-pornography. It's not that simplistic, but there's just no space for debating anything other than the very anti. So within this expert sort of status and the experts that we bring in, you know, what do we do? So, and challenging the isms, the negative isms, what's the role of society? What's the role of the school, the individual schools? What's the role of our young people? Because again, quite often we talk about, you know, a call-out culture. You can't be a bystander. If you see this happening, call it out. It's just like withdrawing consent. You know, in theory you can do it, but it's a lot harder to actually do in practice. So yeah, I think that's a problem, and I think again we need to situate all of this within the wider context of what's happening in our society and internationally as well. I know at the moment in the UK, feelings and tensions are just, it's pretty bad, and Northern Ireland in particular is pretty bad. And I can see that going through, and I think we, and our young people in particular, tend to think that we're quite isolated from it here because we're so far away geographically. But we're not, because that's where we lift our resources from whenever it comes to pornography and sexting and all sorts of things. So, yeah.
John?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of, this notion of there are darker sides which sort of crop up. I'm very interested in the notion that of generational shifts. So really, the story you're telling, Claire, I think is one which probably relates in the UK, particularly in England, back to sort of the shifts of the financial shocks and the austerity. The tightening and hardening of attitudes towards schooling, so the whole sort of uniform discourse, and the schools which are increasingly academized, they call themselves academies, but they have zero tolerance of misbehaviour. Those types of they tell students how to dress, how to think, all in the name of making sure that the results are they perform to the neoliberal, sort of performative agendas. Those have not been historicised carefully enough. And the relationship to the wider, a president who feels it's okay to routinely tweet and demean women and young women in particular, all create a sort of a wider framework into this. And even the BBC, my God, even the BBC is guilty. I watched there was a documentary with the BBC political correspondent Laura Kusenberg, and it follows her just the events leading up to the non-Brexit. On the 29th, where she literally is following these privileged white male who are behaving as though they're in an English public school. And she has to simply just lap it up in a way. She gets Boris Johnson, God bless, crying on her shoulder at one point. It's like, my God, we are talking about dark sides of modernity here, aren't we? Who wants that to happen? So historicising these, I mean, I don't know. The cultural politics of education at all levels is playing itself out here, and that's what we're in. That's what the extraordinary times are, I think. There aren't easy answers. But you're right, you can't stand by.
Thank you so very, very much for your candid and very heartfelt and powerful, I think, messages that have left me with an even bigger pit of fear in my stomach about the trajectory we face and the issues we face and the serious conversations that we all should be having, not just as educators, some of us are, some of us are not, but just as citizens of the world, really. So I want to thank you all for listening. I want to thank you very much for your contributions. I want to give you a round of applause, and then I would like to open up the floor for some questions and comments and discussion. So thank you.